The book of Revelation was written in symbols, and so it was probably not exactly 10 days, but really a short period of time they would have to suffer compared to a lengthy time, like 1,000 years, like we read in chapter 20. 1,000 years. God's not so concerned about the number of years, but we do get concerned about it. When we're suffering, 10 days can seem like a long time. Have you ever had a toothache? It seems like you always get a toothache on Friday night. Or the dentist is closed on Friday afternoon, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, unless it's so bad he has to open his office up. Some of them will do that, and some of them will say, take Tylenol, sleep on it. But it's hard to wait when we're in pain. And yet 10 days we can endure that. That's why Jesus was telling his people, you endure this. It's a tribulation period of 10 days, but be faithful unto death, I'll give thee the crown of life. Revelation 2:10. So, 2,000 years may seem like 2 days to God, and not really, because he's not time-bound. He inhabits eternity. He's from everlasting to everlasting. The psalmist said, thou art God, from everlasting to everlasting. But we do think about 1,000 years to be a long period of time. But when you think about the age of the Bible and the things that we look at a rock and know the heavens and the earth, we know things can be very old. And so people have debated, how old is the earth? People that follow evolution and try to say the present is the key to the past, they would like to extrapolate backwards and say, okay, what we observe now has always been happening at the same rate, and therefore we can do the math and find out the earth is, they always change it, but 4.6 billion years old, or 13 billion, or, they're always changing it. But if you take Bible history, you find out that you don't have to use that big word, uniformitarianism, the present, the key to the past, because it doesn't make sense. Think about how Airport Road changed in 1989 when that tornado came through. Things haven't been happening at the same rate all around us. Huntsville's changing right now as we speak. Very few things stay the same at the same rate. So that's really a ridiculous idea. I learned that principle in the 5th grade. I remember Miss White wrote that long word on the board. And I thought, that's an impressive looking word. But it doesn't make any sense even to a 5th grader. And it doesn't make sense because what they're ruling out is not only natural processes don't work at the same rate, but they're ruling out the supernatural power of God. And God, when he entered in with supernatural power, changed the way things looked. When Adam was 2 seconds old, what did he look like? He looked like a grown man. What a tree looked like when it was 5 minutes old. It looked like an adult tree. It appeared, apparent age doesn't always mean actual age. And so if you take Bible history, the Bible is not an argument, but it's showing that when it started out, things appeared to be much older than they actually were. And we don't know how old the earth is exactly, but biblically speaking, you're looking at 6,000 to 10,000 years of biblical history. And you would have to go back and add things into the scripture, like a gap theory and all these things that men have tried to do to accommodate evolution. Trying to wed evolution and theism, coming up with theistic evolution, as if God needed evolution to get everything in place. Well, the Bible says that God spoke and the earth stood fast. He made the stars. He made the creeping things. He made the sea to be teeming with life. He created man instantly, and woman, he created her from the rib of Adam. And so God is not worried about time. But we look at time, and God worked with Abraham 2,000 years before Christ. He made promises to Abraham, and Abraham could stand on those promises of God. He stood faithful on God's promises, even believing when God said, you take the son of your old age that you finally received by promise, and you kill him. Abraham obeyed God, was willing to kill and sacrifice his son. believing that God could raise him from the dead. He had a true, exact, pure faith in God, and he didn't waver at God's promises. This man became the father of many nations. He's the father of the Arabs, the Ishmaelites, the Egyptians. He's the father of all Hebrews. Now, all Jews are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Jews. The Jews began to be called Jews from the tribe of Judah after they came back from Babylonian captivity. And in the time of Esther. However, we've got some songs that we teach little children that are doing Jews. The first one's name was Abraham. No, he was never a Jew, he was a Hebrew. His descendants were Jews, some of them were. And Isaac was not a Jew, Jacob was not a Jew. They were the fathers of some of the people that later became Jews. But the Midianites were also descendants of Abraham. He was the father of many nations. Ishmael, his firstborn son, had 12 princes that came from him, and they had many descendants. And of course, Jacob, his grandson, had 12 came from those sons, made up the tribes that later formed the nation of Israel. So let's move 500 years after Abraham, and we find a man named Moses. He was born right around 500 years after Abraham, and he also descended from Abraham through Levi. And he was a man that God chose from the time he was a baby to one day deliver his children, the children of Israel, out of Egyptian bondage. God had allowed for 400 plus years his people to be taken captive in Egypt. And God raised up Moses 500 years after Abraham to take them out of their Egyptian bondage to a promised land. And he did that. Well, what happened 500 years after Moses? Well, there was Saul, David, Solomon. These were the first kings of the people that Moses had led out of Egypt. They had formed a nation. They had fulfilled the promises that God had promised to Abraham. His people were given a land. They were formed a great nation, God's holy people. But they wanted a king, and they were rejecting God as their king. They wanted an earthly king like all the nations around them, so God gave them Saul. And then God gave them David after Saul sinned. And David was a man after God's own heart. We know what a great man David was. Abraham was promised that through his seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. And it is true. When we read Galatians 3 verse 16, when God made that promise to Abraham 2,000 years before Christ, he was referring to Christ, who was of the seed of Abraham. He didn't mean seeds as of many, that God would bless all families of the earth through all the descendants of Abraham. He was pointing to one man, one seed, and that is Christ. Galatians 3 verse 16. But Jesus did not only descend from Abraham, Jesus also descended from David, who lived 1,000 years after Abraham. When you open the New Testament, the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Two great characters that stood 1,000 years apart. One 2,000 years before Christ, and another 1,000 years before Christ. And these two great men in Jesus' lineage brought about the promise that God, through Jesus, the promised seed, would potentially bless all peoples in all nations, in all families of the earth. And I say potentially because it will lead to those who respond to the activities of grace that God dispenses through Christ. We are saved by grace through faith. God gives the grace. We respond to it by faith. That is obedient faith, like Abraham's. So Moses, when he came along 500 years after Abraham, as a little baby, had to be hidden out. He was the special child chosen, and the king had an order to try to kill him. You fast forward 1,500 years to Jesus, and King Herod's trying to kill baby Jesus. So there's some parallels there. We also find some parallels in one of the sons of Jacob. This would be the great-grandson of Abraham, and his son Joseph. Joseph was sold for pieces of silver. Jesus would be sold for pieces of silver. Joseph was innocent of his crimes and yet mistreated. Jesus was innocent of his crimes and mistreated. And so we find these events taking place, and Luke tells us how these things come to pass, giving us the generations that show us how that Jesus goes all the way back to Adam, through great men like Abraham and David. Abraham 2,000 years before Christ, David 1,000 years before Christ, Moses 1,500 years before Christ. So what about 500 years before Christ? This is the time when captive and they're learning their lesson of idolatry, that it's wrong before God, who is alone to be worshipped and alone to be served. And so they had to learn that there is one true and living God. And they learned this through their captivity and their return, where they could rebuild their temple and prepare for the coming of Jesus the Messiah. They were cured of their idolatry in Babylon. And that's why Jesus would later pray, the night before he was crucified, in John 17, verse 3, that this is life eternal, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. There's only one true God, and God's own people had to learn that. They were given the commandments 1,500 years before Christ. Thou shalt have no other God before me, but they didn't obey that commandment. They broke it. And they had to learn from the hard way through discipline and punishment. They had to learn that there is no God but the true and living God. So we get to the time of Christ. It's like a long time for us. But we could say, with God, it's like 2 days. 1 Peter 3 and verse 8. So what happened 2,000 years ago? Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. We learned that God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. But God didn't just send his Son. Notice it says, but when the fullness of the time, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So Jesus came in the fullness of time. In other words, just the right time in human history, God sent forth his Son. Someone would say, well, why didn't Jesus come in the 21st century? We've got the internet. We've got satellite communications. We communicate with cell phones. We communicate with so many things. It's so much easier now. Why did he go back in the 20th century when they didn't have cars? They didn't have trains. In the first century, I should say. First century. Well, the reason Jesus came in the first century was a lot better than the 21st century. Because it was a time the world was united under the brutal force of the Pax Romana. That is, the Roman peace. The Romans ruled with a mighty hand, a hand of